All measures are dirty. Nothing is accurate. Good morning. Happy Tuesday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. Okay, wacky weather. Had some stuff I had to do this morning. Running behind. Time is short. Let's dig into Tuesday's Q&A. This comes from Brian. Brian with an I. Brian says, "Hi, Bill." Hi, Brian. He says, "I just watched your video on the extreme hip flexion measures where the spine is a source of compensation that magnifies the hip ER range. I'm assuming that there's a similar explanation for the extreme IR range of motion. If so, can you unpack that for me?" Brian, I would be very, very happy to unpack that. But let's talk about measures in general first and foremost. All measures are dirty. Nothing is accurate. So we have to respect that fact. I can honestly say that I probably never measured anyone accurately, but what I have become over time, so I've been doing this for 30 years, what I have become is reliable. So I'm very consistent with how I execute and have probably improved in the last 10 years, even more so, because I've paid a lot closer attention to how I do certain things. And we can talk about that at a later date, but there's like a shoulder flexion video on YouTube that might be of use to you in regards to how we have to control some of the things that we actually can control as we measure. But in general, let's just respect the fact that there's stuff going on underneath our measures. Now, when we see something that appears to be magnified, so when we talked about the hip external rotation video, a lot of that stuff gets blamed on laxity. Like people say, oh, you have overstretched ligaments, etc., and this is why we see these crazy measures. Well, that's just the failure of the structural reductionist model, not respecting the fact that there is shape change in the axial skeleton, there's reorientation of the sockets, and that promotes changes in the way that the measurements arise. So we have multiple influences. We've got a position, we've got connective tissue orientations, we've got muscle orientations that all influence these outcomes. And this crazy internal rotation measure is one of those as well. And so what you'll end up seeing, so if we looked at the average measure, remember we don't talk about norms, we talk about averages, we look at an average measure of hip internal rotation depending on what textbook you look at, it's going to be somewhere around 40 degrees. But then you got that patient that walks in and you throw them on the table and you're measuring them, they go, oh my gosh, they have 60 degrees of hip internal rotation. You go, oh my goodness, that hip capsule is lax, and it's usually not. So let's talk about what the orientation is that we're typically seeing under these circumstances, and then we can kind of, as you asked for, we will unpack this to a degree. So if I'm looking at the orientation of the acetabulum, and if I look at the ligamentous structure of the hip has this cool little spiral kind of an orientation to it. And so the orientation in itself is, if I try to turn this thing into internal rotation, it creates a constraint because it's already twisted in that direction to a certain degree. So this is one of the dirty little secrets about lower extremities, is they're already twisted into internal rotation. That's why the dorsum of your foot is on top when it should be on the bottom. And so this is the twist. So if I try to twist this farther, I hit the constraint. But if I look at orientation of this innominate, I can actually put this in a position where I actually untwist the orientation of the hip, and all I have to do is move it up and over top of that femur. So this is going to be an anterior orientation, so I will have traditional extension of the lumbar spine on the side where you get the magnified measure. And so that's going to take this pelvis forward and over top of the femur. And if I take it far enough, I'm going to start to pick up internal rotation, because essentially what I'm doing is I'm untwisting the capsule, and then I take my measurement, and then that picks up all that laxity. It's not laxity, it's just slack in the capsule created by position. I take that up, and then I hit the constraint somewhere about 60 because I'm using a dead guy 0 position. So a nice representation that I can use is sort of this wringing out the towel concept. So if I look at the twisted towel as if this was the ligamentous structure of the hip, when I'm moving my internal rotation, it's already twisted, and so there's my constraint to internal rotation. But if I reorient the pelvis where it's over top of the femur, and I actually start to untwist the towel first, then I have all of this slack that I can take up in the hip capsule, which is going to give me my magnified internal rotation. So remember that I have other internal rotation measures to compare against to make sure that I am dealing with this orientation problem. So for instance, if I lack traditional hip extension or adduction. So traditional hip extension and adduction are internal rotation measures. So if I have a deficit in either one of those, then I know that my magnified internal rotation measure is most likely associated with this orientation. I also have my iterations to compare against as well. But here's the problem that you're going to run into when you see somebody with this magnified hip internal rotation. Chances are when you lay them on the table, what you would typically see is a loss of hip external rotation associated with the anterior orientation. So your expectation is that the same side shoulder would have a loss of external rotation, but that rarely shows up in this circumstance. Because of the extreme orientation, because of the traditional extension and internal rotation of the lumbar spine, what happens is I get a thorax that would normally be tilted forward, but it falls backwards on the table. This actually magnifies the external rotation measures in traditional external rotation and flexion. So it can be a little bit confusing if you don't have the awareness that the thorax can actually move as you lay them down on the table. So keep that in mind when you're making your comparisons of same side hip to same side shoulder. So Brian, in a nutshell, your strategy is to create the reorientation under these circumstances and not go to blaming laxity, unless you have some scenario where it's going to be very, very clear that they have some form of condition that would actually promote this laxity. Use your comparative measures, understand that all your measurements are dirty, and we have to account for the position on the table. Brian, I hope that answers your question for you. If it doesn't, please ask another question at askbillhartman@gmail.com, askbillhartman@gmail.com, and I will see you guys.